Welcome back to Occult Archives. You know, the deep dive where we kind of peel back the layers on the most intriguing and often, I'd say, feared books in history.
Yeah,
But, today's episode is going to be a little bit different.
right.
We're not going to be focusing on one specific text. Instead, we're taking a look at the history of mass delusion.
That's right.
And we're going to be unearthing some pretty incredible stories of collective madness, financial frenzies, occult follies, all these things that kind of gripped entire societies.
Absolutely. And for this exploration, we are turning to a truly fascinating source, Charles Mackay's Memoirs of Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds. And don't worry, this isn't your typical dry, dusty academic text. It's a captivating journey through some of history's most bizarre moments where, frankly, logic and reason took a backseat.
Yeah, McKay's main idea is that just like us as individuals, nations can also fall prey to these periods of intense irrationality.
Right.
These moments where entire societies become so fixated on a single object or idea, they pursue it with an almost feverish intensity, completely forgetting about common sense.
It's like a societal trance, it's almost like a collective fever dream. And he illustrates this really well with a bunch of compelling historical examples. Like, think about the Crusades. I mean, these waves of people driven by religious fervor for the Holy Land.
Right.
And then you have centuries of the witch mania. Talk about terrifying. A period fueled by this belief in magic and the occult, resulting in the persecution of countless individuals.
And, of course, we can't forget the alchemist's relentless pursuit of the philosopher's stone. This eternal quest filled with all these bizarre practices, all in the hope of achieving the impossible.
Absolutely.
There's another one he talks about that always kind of chills me. It's the fact that slow poisoning became almost fashionable at one point,
Right.
among the upper classes especially.
Yeah. So Mackay details how, during certain periods, getting rid of a rival through a slow-acting poison was almost seen as a minor offense. Something people wouldn't really even hesitate to do, even if outright violence was off the table. And the crazy thing is, he points out that even women of high social standing were in on this, making it an unsettlingly acceptable practice, at least for a time.
It sounds like something out of one of those really dark historical novels.
It does.
But of course, it was all too real.
Yeah.
And, he also talks about these delusions that persisted despite all the advancements in knowledge and, other fields, like those things that just wouldn't go away.
Right. He focuses on things like dueling, this idea of settling disputes through ritualized combat, and then, of course, the unwavering belief in omens and divination. These practices had such a grip on people, almost regardless of social class, and they persisted for centuries.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how deep these beliefs become woven into the fabric of society, defining logic and even the progress of scientific understanding.
And as you might expect, a lot of these mass delusions were driven by, that age-old pursuit of wealth.
Oh, absolutely. Mackay talks about how nations could turn into desperate gamblers overnight, risking their entire existence on these get-rich-quick schemes. And that's where our theme of occult follies and forbidden beliefs really comes in. It turns out a lot of these extraordinary popular delusions, as he calls them, are tied to beliefs that we might consider occult, or at least wildly irrational.
So let's dive right into one of these financial frenzies, the Mississippi scheme in France. Now, at the heart of this was a really interesting character, John Law. What can you tell us about him?
John Law, what a figure. A gambler, a charmer. He was known as Beau Law in his day. And in the end, he became a figure of scorn.
Wow.
He had a past filled with both huge success and really dramatic failures.
A real, boom and bust kind of guy, huh?
Exactly. So after his dad died, he inherited quite a bit of money. He moved to London and basically became notorious for his extravagant lifestyle and, of course, his supposed talent for calculating odds and gambling.
So people saw him as someone who had, the Midas touch, huh?
Exactly. At first, he won a ton of money. And get this, other gamblers started betting on his success. He was a huge social figure too, but his luck didn't last forever.
Yeah.
His gambling became more and more reckless. He started racking up huge losses and ended up having to mortgage his family estate. And to top it all off, he got into some legal trouble because of a romantic entanglement.
So we're talking about a guy with, a pretty colorful past.
Oh, yeah.
So how did this guy end up getting involved in the finances of France, and what exactly was this whole Mississippi Company thing about?
So France at the time was in a bad spot financially, and Law swoops in with this radical idea. He proposes introducing paper money.
Okay.
along with creating a company that would exploit this vast territory in Louisiana, the Mississippi Company.
Okay.
And there was a lot of hype around this Louisiana territory at the time. People thought it was full of resources and that it would be a gold mine.
So it was like a new frontier, like a gold rush kind of thing?
Yeah. Exactly. And initially, people were super enthusiastic about Law's plan. They saw it as a chance to get rich quick. The company's share prices shot up, fueled by this new paper money.
And the Regent of France was all in on this, right? He was like a big supporter of Law's vision.
Oh, completely. The regent's decisions, which were often arbitrary, to be honest, and his unwavering support for Law, well, they were instrumental both in the initial success and the eventual collapse of the whole thing.
So it's like he kind of amplified the whole situation, the good and the bad.
Exactly.
So what happened? What caused this whole thing to crash and burn? What made people panic?
Well, ultimately, people lost trust in the paper money because they couldn't reliably exchange it for actual gold or silver, and there was so much of it floating around. That, combined with growing skepticism about the true value of the Mississippi Company, just led to this massive loss of confidence.
And I heard that they tried some pretty desperate measures to restore faith in the scheme. Like, weren't they rounding up poor people and telling them they were going to go work in gold mines in America?
Yeah, they tried that.
But, like, the gold mines didn't even exist.
Exactly.
That's like a whole other level of crazy, isn't it?
Oh, totally. It was a bizarre and, to be honest, really tragic episode. A lot of those poor people they recruited never even made it to the ports. They deserted, sold whatever few belongings they had, and just tried to go back to their old lives. The whole scheme was a disaster, and it just eroded trust even further.
So I imagine the public's reaction to all this was pretty intense.
Intense is an understatement. People were furious and scared. There were near riots, and both Law and the regent became the targets of real threats. There were even rumors of another St. Bartholomew's Day massacre if things didn't get better. It was a scary time.
Yeah, it sounds like it. So after everything crashed and burned, was there any attempt to, like, hold people accountable for this whole mess?
Well, they did set up a special chamber of justice to investigate anyone who had profited illegally from the scheme. They actually encouraged people to snitch on each other with the promise of a cut of any recovered money. So, you can imagine what happened. People were getting arrested left and right. The prisons were overflowing. The punishments ranged from public humiliation, like being put in the stocks, to being sent to work as slaves on the galleys. And in a few extreme cases, people were even executed.
So what about the mastermind, John Law? Did he face any consequences?
Law lost everything. All his power and influence. He ended up having to flee France. The rest of his life was spent in exile, and guess what? He just kept on gambling.
Oh, wow. You can't teach an old dog new tricks, huh?
I guess not. In the end, he died in obscurity. It's kind of a classic story of a meteoric rise, followed by a devastating fall. Oh, and here's another interesting twist. Even though the Chamber of Justice fined a lot of people, the French government didn't really benefit all that much. Turns out corruption was so rampant that a lot of the recovered money just ended up lining the pockets of powerful individuals.
It's like a real lesson in how greed and corruption can make a bad situation so much worse.
Exactly. And it's interesting because at the same time, over in England, there was another financial frenzy going on, the South Sea Bubble.
The South Sea Bubble, right?
Yeah. Mackay describes it as a copycat of the Mississippi Madness, and it caused a lot of financial hardship in England, too. It's almost like one country looked at the other and thought, we can do that, too.
Yeah, like, oh, my beer.
Exactly. And the funny thing is, while Mackay doesn't go into as much detail about the South Sea Bubble in the parts we're looking at, the core ideas were pretty similar. Mass speculation, a wild ride, and then, boom, a catastrophic collapse.
And of course, before both of those, there was that truly wild episode with tulips in Holland. Tulipomania.
Oh, yeah, Tulipomania. It sounds absolutely unbelievable, right?
A whole country going crazy over flower bulbs.
But it happened.
It's kind of hard to wrap your head around that.
It is. So in the 1630s, the Netherlands was obsessed with tulips. Everyone was caught up in it. And the normal business of the country just completely ground to a halt. People were ditching their jobs and becoming tulip traders.
So what was so special about these tulips? Were they like super rare or something? Were they particularly beautiful?
Well, some types were really sought after, especially the ones with these unusual patterns.
Okay.
They called them broken tulips, and they had these, streaks and flames of color caused by a virus. Prices started going up steadily, and then the speculation took hold, and the prices just skyrocketed. People were investing fortunes in just a handful of bulbs. They even started trading them by weight in something called parrots.
Parrots.
It's like a tiny fraction of a grain.
So they were trading flower bulbs like they were like gold dust or something.
Pretty much, and the prices were insane. We're talking about a tulip called Admiral Leifkin going for 4,400 florins for a tiny amount.
That's crazy.
And then there's the Admiral von der Eyck going for 12,260 florins. But the most expensive of all was the Semper Augustus. A small bulb of that variety could fetch 5,500 florins.
I mean, that's more than most people made in their entire lives.
Right. It's mind-boggling. And Mackay tells these stories that just show you how absurd it all got. There's this famous story about a sailor who ate a valuable Semper Augustus's bulb thinking it was an onion. Can you imagine?
Oh, no.
He was having it with his herring for breakfast. The merchant who owned the bulb was horrified. He said that bulb was worth enough to feed the Prince of Orange and his whole court.
Oh, I bet the sailor felt terrible. And I can only imagine how devastated the merchant must have been.
No, right. That sailor ended up in jail because of his expensive breakfast. And then there's another story about this English botanist who didn't know how much tulips cost.
Okay.
He peeled and dissected an Admiral van der Eyck bulb because he thought it was a weird onion. He was arrested and held until he could pay a fine for thousands of florins for damaging this, super valuable bulb.
So basically, people were treating these delicate flower bulbs as if they were like precious jewels.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And by 1636, it was tulipomania everywhere. They even had official tulip markets on the stock exchanges. It was pure gambling at that point. People were buying and selling tulip futures, betting that the prices would just keep going up and up forever. And of course, at first, a lot of people made a lot of money.
Right, because that's how these things always work.
Yeah, but the whole thing was built on this idea that tulip prices would just keep going up and up forever. It was like they thought all the wealth of Europe would eventually end up in Holland just to buy tulips.
Yeah.
And everyone got swept up in it. Nobles, merchants, farmers, even servants. They were all neglecting their regular jobs and putting every penny they had into tulips. Unfortunately, the excerpts we have end before we get to the crash, but historically we know the bubble did burst and a lot of people lost everything.
Ouch. It's a real cautionary tale about, the dangers of speculative bubbles and getting caught up in the hype.
It is.
So Mackay also talks about delusions of the prophetic and the marvelous. This is where we really start to get into those beliefs that are a little bit occult, right? Or at least pretty irrational.
Yeah. So he's writing at a time when there was growing skepticism about prophecies. But he points out that even educated people couldn't totally resist their allure.
It's like a guilty pleasure.
Totally. And he gives some really interesting examples, like Merlin.
Oh, Merlin, the wizard.
Yeah. The legend of Merlin is that he was born of a virgin and his father was the devil.
Oh.
And the story goes that he could talk from the time he was a baby.
That's pretty impressive.
I know, right?
For a baby, I mean.
Yeah. And there's even the story about a judge who questioned baby Merlin about his parentage, and Merlin gave this really clever, evasive answer. It basically cemented his reputation for being incredibly wise, even as an infant.
So like a child prodigy of the magical world.
Yeah, pretty much.
And then there's Mother Shipton.
Ah, Mother Shipton, another famous English prophetess. Her prophecies were really popular. People kept interpreting and reinterpreting them for generations.
So like Nostradamus, but, English.
Kind of.
Okay.
Yeah.
And there's also Peter of Pomfret.
Right. Yes. Peter of Pomfret. Now, he was a self-proclaimed prophet and a bard, and he supposedly predicted some bad things that were going to happen to King John.
Like what?
Well, among other things, he predicted King John would be deposed. And when people called him out for being a false prophet, Peter argued that King John had actually surrendered his crown to the Pope.
Oh, clever.
Right. And he was paying the Pope an annual tribute, so technically he was no longer king. And Mackay says that this convinced a lot of people, including a writer named Haywood, who really believed in prophecies.
Yeah.
It just goes to show how much people want to believe.
Yeah.
And how they'll twist logic to fit their existing beliefs.
And that leads us to Mackay's idea of, the love of the marvelous and the disbelief of the true.
Yeah, he says humans are just drawn to extraordinary things. We'd rather believe a wild story than accept a boring fact.
Makes sense.
He brings up Shakespeare's Richard III, with the ghosts and all that, as an example. It shows how much people believed in omens and supernatural warnings back then.
Yeah, it's like we're programmed to be fascinated by the supernatural, the unexplained.
Exactly. And he also talks about the stories surrounding Richard the Lionheart.
Oh, Richard the Lionheart.
Yeah.
The legendary Crusader king, right.
That's right.
What about him?
Well, Mackay says that all these stories about Richard's amazing bravery and strength were exaggerated.
Okay.
But these stories became legends, and people started saying things like, "Dost thou think King Richard is in the bush?"
Oh, right, right.
It's basically an example of how we love to build up these larger-than-life heroes.
Yeah.
And their embellished stories just fuel our fascination with the extraordinary.
So this love of the marvelous, this craving for something beyond the ordinary, it seems like it's been a big part of why so many of these mass delusions have taken hold throughout history.
Absolutely. And this theme comes up again and again in Mackay's work. Like when he talks about duels and ordeals, he sees them as these deeply ingrained rituals that are actually, when you think about it, totally irrational.
Duels, yeah. It's crazy to think that people used to settle their differences by, literally fighting to the death. It seems so pointless by today's standards.
I know, right?
But it was a huge part of European culture for centuries, especially among the nobles.
Yeah.
It was all about honor and these really elaborate rituals with seconds and specific weapons. It was a whole thing.
It was a whole production.
Yeah.
And Mackay describes some infamous duels. Like there's one between the Duc de Beaufort and the Marquis de Nemours where both of them were killed.
Oh, wow.
And then, get this, their seconds also ended up fighting each other to the death.
I mean, that's just like a whole other level of commitment to this idea of honor, isn't it?
It really is. There's even a quote from this guy, the Count de Bussy-Rabutin, who said that men were so eager to be seconds in duels that they would sometimes start fights just for the opportunity.
It's like they were looking for any excuse to get in on the action.
Exactly. And they tried to stop dueling. Louis XIV, he had this edict called the Chambre Ardente, but it didn't really work. Even Henry IV, he didn't like dueling, but he kind of admired the whole idea of it, too. He was reluctant to punish people too harshly for it. And Mackay says that something like 4,000 French gentlemen died in duels in just 18 years during Henry IV's reign.
4,000.
I know, it's insane. And then there's Sully, Henry IV's minister. He was totally against dueling. He kept urging the king to do more to stop it. He even suggested setting up a court of honor to resolve disputes without all the bloodshed. But even Sully couldn't totally get rid of the practice.
Wow.
Duels kept happening for centuries. Like there was that famous one between Lord Byron and Mr. Chaworth in the 18th century.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was a tough tradition to break. And then, of course, you have the ordeals. These were the ancient ways of determining guilt or innocence. And let me tell you, they were even more irrational than dueling.
Yeah, like trial by fire or water.
Exactly. It was all based on this belief that God would step in to protect innocent people.
Yeah.
So you had the ordeal by the cross, where the accused had to stand with their arms outstretched.
Okay.
And the priest could kind of rig it, make it easier or harder depending on who they thought was guilty.
So not exactly a fair system.
Not at all. Then you had the fire ordeal. This was the one where the accused had to walk across red-hot plowshares or carry a piece of burning iron. And again, the priests were usually in charge, so they could make it as painful or as painless as they wanted.
Yeah, sounds like a lot of room for manipulation there.
Absolutely. There's the famous story of Emma, King Ethelred's wife. She supposedly cleared her name by walking across hot plowshares, but most historians think the priests probably made sure she wouldn't get burned.
Yeah.
They wanted her to be found innocent. And then there was the water ordeal. This one was usually for poor people.
Okay.
They'd be tied up and thrown into water, and if they sank, they were innocent. If they floated, they were guilty.
That doesn't sound like a good situation for anyone involved.
It wasn't. And even the priests had their own special ordeal. It was called the corsned. They had to swallow a piece of consecrated bread and cheese, and if they choked, they were guilty.
And did any of them ever choke?
Mackay says there's no record of it ever happening.
Makes you wonder. It all sounds like a way to reinforce the power of the church and, keep people in line.
Yeah, pretty much.
Less about justice, more about control.
Exactly. And it wasn't just criminal trials.
Right.
They used these ordeals for all sorts of things. Like, they even thought about using trial by combat to decide whether to adopt the Gregorian chant in Castile.
Serious?
Yeah. They were going to throw the old and new liturgical texts into a fire and see which one God preserved.
That's amazing.
And they even used trial by combat to settle legal disputes, like inheritance cases. It was like they believed that physical strength was the same as being right.
Yeah.
A very different worldview from what we have today.
Absolutely. And of course, we can't talk about mass delusions without talking about the Crusades.
No.
And while we learn about them in history books as these big religious wars, Mackay presents them as kind of an early form of collective madness.
Yeah, he emphasizes how strong the religious zeal was at the time. People were so caught up in the idea of fighting for the Holy Land that they were willing to leave everything behind and risk their lives.
Yeah.
He talks about the early fervor surrounding the sepulchre of Jesus and the legendary exploits of Richard the Lionheart during the Third Crusade. And he points to the tournament organized by Count Thibaut of Champagne as this key event that kind of reignited everyone's enthusiasm for the Crusades.
So it was like a big pep rally for holy war.
I,
But it wasn't just religious zeal that drove the Crusades, right?
Of course not. There were political and economic motives at play, too.
Yeah.
And Mackay brings that up with the Fourth Crusade, the one that went off course and ended up sacking Constantinople.
Oh, yeah. One of the most infamous episodes in the history of the Crusades.
It was. And it all started because of Alexius, this deposed Byzantine prince. He promised the Crusaders all these rewards if they'd help him get his throne back.
Okay.
But once they got to Constantinople, things kind of went off the rails. The Crusaders sacked the city, looted everything, and destroyed countless works of art. It's a really dark chapter in history, and it shows how these religious movements could be hijacked by greed and political ambition.
Yeah, like, it's one thing to fight for a holy cause.
Right.
But when you start looting and destroying, it kind of loses its moral high ground, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And as the Crusades went on, people started to lose their enthusiasm. The later Crusades, like the Children's Crusade and St. Louis IX's campaigns, were met with a lot more skepticism.
The Children's Crusade, wow. That's a whole other story, but like a really tragic delusion.
Yeah, really tragic.
But, it seems like people were starting to realize that the Crusades weren't all they were cracked up to be.
Right. They were expensive, they were dangerous,
Yeah.
and they weren't always very successful. So, yeah, even the most deeply held beliefs can start to crumble when they're confronted with reality.
Yeah. And of course, we have to talk about the witch mania, one of the most widespread and terrifying delusions in history.
Absolutely chilling.
I mean, the fact that hundreds of thousands of people were accused, tortured, and executed based on what we now know were totally absurd accusations is just horrifying.
It really is. And Mackay points out how easy it was to accuse someone of witchcraft and how hard it was for them to defend themselves. You were basically guilty until proven innocent.
Yeah.
And a lot of times these accusations were motivated by personal vendettas or power struggles.
Okay.
Powerful people would use witchcraft as a way to get rid of their rivals. Mackay uses the persecution of the Stedinger and the Knights Templar as examples of this. And then you had all these beliefs about witches, that they could fly, that they had meetings with the devil, that they could curse people.
Yeah.
And all of this just created an atmosphere of fear and paranoia.
And of course, there was the belief in werewolves, the loup garrus.
Right.
Like, that was part of this whole witchcraft hysteria, wasn't it?
Definitely. Mackay talks about these trials in France where people were accused of being werewolves and of attacking and eating children. It's pretty gruesome stuff.
Yeah, really dark.
And they even passed laws that said you could be burned alive just for owning a book of spells.
Yeah.
It's a really dangerous time to be different or to, hold unconventional beliefs.
Yeah, absolutely. Mackay gives some really chilling examples of specific cases, too.
Yeah, like that one in Auvergne,
Okay.
where a huntsman finds a woman's hand with a wedding ring on it inside a wolf that he had killed. And guess what?
Yeah.
They ended up accusing his wife of witchcraft. It's just, so tragic.
And then there was that case in Scotland where a woman chose to be burned as a witch rather than live with a constant fear and suspicion.
I know, it's heartbreaking.
Really shows you how deeply this fear had permeated society. And even high-ranking people weren't immune to these accusations, like the Maréchal d'Ancre.
The Maréchal d'Ancre.
Right.
So while she was formally accused of witchcraft, Mackay thinks she was probably executed for political reasons. She was really influential, and some people wanted her out of the picture.
So they used witchcraft as an excuse to get rid of her.
Exactly. And then there were those really brutal witch trials in Le Bourg, led by Pierre de Lancre.
Yeah, what about those?
So de Lancre was a member of parliament, and he was completely obsessed with witches.
Okay.
He even wrote this book about them, and it's filled with really disturbing stuff.
Yeah.
But it shows you just how many people were being accused and executed based on, the flimsiest evidence. They'd torture people until they confessed to all sorts of crazy things, like attending these Sabbaths where they'd worship the devil.
Yeah.
It was a total witch hunt.
And then there were those Swedish witch trials where children were the main witnesses.
Oh, those were really messed up. So in the 1670s in Sweden, you had all these kids saying that they'd been taken to this place called Blockula. Yeah, it was supposedly supposedly this island where witches had their Sabbaths.
Yeah.
And these kids said they'd seen all these horrible things, like witches eating babies and dancing with the devil.
Wow.
And based on these kids' stories, they executed dozens of people. It's a really tragic example of how easily mass hysteria can spread.
Yeah, and how children can be, like, manipulated into believing things that aren't true.
Absolutely. It's a really dark chapter in human history.
So from the very public panic surrounding witchcraft, we move to something a little bit more, I guess, secretive and insidious. The slow poisoners.
Yeah, the slow poisoners. It's like something out of a Renaissance thriller.
It really is. Mackay says this practice started in Italy. He talks about this woman named Tulipomania.
Tulipomania.
Yeah.
She was infamous for selling this poison called aqua tofana.
Okay.
And it was a really popular way to get rid of unwanted spouses or rivals. It was odorless, tasteless, and it killed slowly.
So, like, the perfect murder weapon.
Pretty much.
For a while, at least.
Yeah.
What happened to her?
Well, she was eventually caught.
Okay.
And under torture, she confessed and named all her customers. She was eventually strangled.
Wow. So that was the end of Tulipomania. But this whole slow poisoning thing, it spread to France, right?
It did.
And it became a huge problem.
Huge.
Like a real epidemic of poisoning.
Yeah, especially in the 1670s and 1680s. There was so much of it going on that Madame de Sévigné, the famous letter writer,
Yeah.
she even said she was worried that Frenchman and poisoner would become, like, synonymous terms.
Oh, wow. That's a pretty damning statement. So how did they finally start cracking down on all this poisoning?
Well, it's actually kind of interesting.
Oh.
It was the priests who first alerted the authorities.
Oh, really?
Yeah. People were confessing to poisoning their spouses in the confessional.
Wow.
And of course, the priests couldn't keep that secret. So that's how the investigation started.
So it's like the church inadvertently became the poison control center.
Yeah, kind of. And then you had some really famous figures who got caught up in all this.
Like Madame de Brinvilliers.
Exactly. She was a noble woman, and she was connected to some of the most powerful people in France.
Okay.
And she was ruthless. Mackay says she showed signs of cruelty from a very young age.
Wow.
Her crimes were just horrific. I mean, too many to list here.
Okay.
But she was finally caught and executed. They burned her alive.
That's a pretty gruesome end.
It is. And then there's Lavoisin.
Le Voisin.
Yeah, she was even more deeply involved in this whole world of poison and the occult.
Okay.
She had this huge network. They were selling poisons, but they were also doing fortune-telling and all sorts of other shady stuff.
So like a one-stop shop for your criminal and occult needs.
Pretty much. And when she was arrested, they found her client list. And it included some really big names.
Like who?
The Marshal de Luxembourg,
Okay.
the Countess de Soissons,
Yeah?
the Duchess de Bouillon.
Wow.
Some of these people were probably just into the fortune-telling aspect, but others were suspected of being involved in the poisoning too. The Duchess de Bouillon even ended up standing trial.
Oh, wow.
But it seems like she was mainly interested in knowing the future, not in actually poisoning people.
Okay.
But still, Lavoisin's network was huge, and it took a lot of executions to finally dismantle.